Hey everyone, Ari here from Crustcraft Surfboards. So I've been shaping for the past few years and wanted to make a quick tutorial on how to shape your first board. I found a lot of tutorials lean really heavily into using a planer, which especially when you're starting out can be really intimidating. So just wanted to make a no planer necessary walkthrough. So obviously here you can see that I am using a planer, but is the only time in this video that I'll really be using one. Instead of a planer at this point of the process is just using a really heavy grit sanding block, and I'll leave the link to a few different tools that you'll need, including a heavy sanding block, in the description below. So what I'm doing here is taking down this blank. So it started at 3 inches thick, and I want to make this board 2.5 inches thick. So what I'm doing is doing a 1/8 of an inch pass off of the top of the board that you'll see momentarily, and then two 1/8 of an inch passes off of the bottom, making it 2 5/8 thick. So the reason why we're leaving that 1/8 of an inch thickness is just to leave some room for concaves later on. And then don't be nervous here. Feel free to just kind of mow foam. There's really nothing that you can't sand away at this stage of the process. And so you can see here, sanding away the imperfections of that pass. And then a common theme to think about as you're shaping your board is just to use long continuous movements. So longer strokes really help make your curves continuous so that the waters are flowing through your board in the right way. And my favorite technique to do this is this that I'm using right here. So spreading your legs out and then going all the way back and forth, all the way up and down the board to make sure that everything is even against that water is flowing through your board in the right way. So here I am taking that 1/8 of an inch pass off of the top of the board, and then we'll do a very similar sanding process on the top as well. So the nose of the board, especially using a planer, is a little bit trickier to get, and again, something you can just kind of hand sand down. The other thing that's really helpful to think about as you're going through this is to make sure that you're happy with each step of the process before moving on to the next. So a really common theme where you won't be happy with the end product is if you didn't spend enough time making sure that you've sanded down everything to the desired thickness, or you haven't squared off your rails, which I'll show you momentarily too. So just really making sure that after each step of the process, you're happy with it, and then you're moving on to the next as well. So here I'm going from a really heavy grit sanding block to a much finer one at 80 or 120, just to scuff out any kind of imperfections from those passes as well. And then using calipers, I'm actually checking the thickness to make sure I'm at that 2 5/8 mark. From here, we're actually going to draw in our template. So this template is from Kazuma Surfboards. It's a 6'3" step up. That is the one that I've been using, that I've been really liking. I really like their templates. And so again, I'll link them in the description below. And they also have really great surfboard shaping content as well that I would definitely recommend checking out. So as you're drawing your template, just making sure that you're doing it in the same way on either side. And then after you're done doing so, making sure that you're actually checking your work, that it actually is even. So whether that's taking a tape measure or an easy foam measuring piece to make sure that it's even on either side, I'd recommend checking it every kind of 6 to 12 inches. And then something that's really helpful is actually putting your board up against a wall and taking a step back and seeing if it all looks even. So your eyes are definitely something that you can trust throughout this entire process. So from here, what we're going to do is cut out that outline with a saw. So what I'm doing is about a 1/2 of an inch away from that outline, I'm using a saw to cut off the foam. And then from there, we'll use a sanding tool to make sure that we are actually truing up that outline right against that pencil marking of that template outline. From here, you want to just try to make the saw cuts as straight up and down as possible so that you're not cutting into the outline whatsoever. And then from here, we'll actually use that 90-degree angle sanding block to make sure that our outline is correct and that our rails are square. So making sure that your rails are square is a really, really important piece of this process too, just to make sure that your rails actually come out even once you start to shape those rails. So that is one of the most kind of crucial pieces of this process, is to make sure that your outline is right and that that angle is that perfect 90-degree angle so that your rails come out to how you really want them to be. So really take your time here to make sure that that end product is the way you want it. And then obviously just doing the same on both sides, just using a different sanding block here, and then I'll eventually use that 90-degree block to true that up as well. From here, just cutting off the little bit of foam that's left in the nose, so nothing to really write home about here. So after a bit more sanding, I actually trued up this entire outline, looking at it, and then again, putting it up against the wall, taking a few steps back, checking my work, making sure that everything looks good. And again, you can really kind of trust your eyes here as well. And then from here, what we're going to do is start to set that rocker. So what we're doing is taking foam out of the tail. What I'm doing is taking this heavy grit sanding block, moving it back and forth to get to 5/8 of an inch thick on the tail, and then blending that in to the rest of the board. So as you're doing your rockers, as you're setting the tail as well as the nose, it's a really similar process looking at the tail and the nose. For the tail, typical, easy, kind of two numbers to think about as you're setting both is if you're doing a shortboard, is to do a 2.5 inch kick in the tail and a 5-inch kick in the nose. And then just blending that into the belly of the board. Here, this is just a rocker measuring tool. So really all it is a pole so that I can measure how far down from flat this rocker is. So again, you want that tail to be about 5/8 of an inch thick, and then the nose, as you're bringing it down, to be about 1/4 of an inch thick. So what I'm going to do is take that measuring tool, or that rocker measuring tool, marking it down 5 inches from that tool, and then doing another mark at 5 inches and 1/4 of an inch below that. So what you'll do is you'll take out down the bottom of the board using a sanding block, blending that in, really similar to what you saw in the tail. And then what we're going to do, that you'll see momentarily, is flip over the board and do the same, but on the actual deck and nose of the board. During this part, just make sure you're not pressing too hard because you can actually break off the nose of your board. So just take your time, just be careful as you're going through this, and then making sure that both sides are even as well. And then here I am actually blending in me bringing down the nose into the rest of the board. And then luckily saved that one. So then we're going to flip over the board and then do something really similar to the nose. So this is what I was doing on the other side of the nose too, really similar on the top of the nose. What you're doing is you're just taking a sanding block and scooping it out and getting down to that 5 1/4 inch mark. So here, just scooping it out with a little planer, taking down that stringer too. Again, something you'll take your time as you're scooping this out. All you're doing is sanding it down here and then blending it into the belly of the board. What's helpful, since there is a kick in the nose, is just to kind of scoop the sander as you're doing it. And then again, making sure that you're actually blending that into the middle of the board. Then here, I'm just using a finer grit sanding paper to scuff out any imperfections. So from here, the next stage of the process is to set those concaves. So once you've done the flip in the nose, flip in the tail, you can then set those concaves. And again, we're going to do an 1/8 inch concave in the middle and the belly of the board. Then between the fins, we'll do a double and then a V out the tail. Really common bottom contours that you'll see on most boards. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using a really heavy grit sanding block and taking down the middle of the board an 1/8 inch. And then just try to make sure that as you're sanding through that you're doing it even on both sides. And then I'm using those calipers to check my work too. Then once I take that heavy grit sandpaper, I'll take a much finer grit sandpaper and using in that circular motion just to really true up that concave and make it blend into the rest of the belly of that board. So then from here, you can actually check your concaves with just any flat tool. And then now we are going to set that double concave in between the fins. So I like to do it a little bit less than an 1/8 inch. So if you can do it about a 1/16 inch, just really kind of subtle concaves, that's my favorite. And then doing a really, really slight V out the tail. And then I am taking a finer sanding block, folding it over a little bit and scooping those double concaves too. And then from there, I'm blending in that single concave into the double. So just really using a finer grit sanding block to pull that single into that double and then that little bit of V out the tail. And then again, using that same tool, you can actually check those concaves. Looking at that V, looking at that middle single, and the double between the feet. So from here, what we're doing is setting the rails. So what I'm doing here is using a rail scribe tool and setting it to 2 inches and making a 2-inch mark on the deck. And then after that, we will be doing a mark on the rail that is 1 1/8 of an inch. So I take those same measurements. I do that for pretty much all my boards, and they seem to work really well for different templates and thicknesses and everything like that. So from the bottom of the board, it's an 1 1/8 from the bottom of the board. And then from here, really the goal is to connect that 2 inch mark to that 1 1/8 mark on the rail. So something to really keep in mind here is to not ever sand into your actual outline and the flat pieces on the end. So there'll be a small gap below your initial kind of rail bands on the top of the board and then your tuck on the bottom that you never want to touch. That's kind of how you get a really wavy outline. So all I'm doing here is connecting that 2 inch mark to that 1 1/8 inch mark using a really heavy grit sanding block. And then obviously doing the same on both sides, making sure that they're even. So just bringing that down. And then from there, there'll be a slight bump in between the actual deck and that cut that you just made with that sanding block. And so all I'm doing is really just taking down that bump, sanding right on that bump to blend in those curves. So you can also make a 4-inch mark as well if it blends into the board and you feel like you need to. But with this particular blank, I didn't feel like I really needed that. And then after doing so, just taking a really high grit sanding paper to blend those two together. Really, as you're doing the deck, to focus really on that kind of middle part with that heavy sanding block, and then the nose and the tail. So that back quarter and that front quarter, I suggest doing so by hand and then just blending that in. So you really want to kind of feather it out in the nose and in the tail, so not taking so much foam off there. So you can see here, using a couple different sanding blocks to blend that in, and this is really kind of where your shaper's eye can come into play. And then just using a fine screen to blend it in at the nose. Then all I'm doing here is using a soft sponge at, it looks like 120 grit. So just another piece of sanding paper that's 120 grit just to blend in those imperfections. So then to do that actual bottom tuck, I'll typically do a 1/2 of an inch tuck. That's typically what's common, 1/2 an inch, 3/8 of an inch if you like a little bit more of a kind of down rail. And I'm making those marks on each side of the bottom rail. And then we'll use a tool, the similar tool or the same tool that we use to square up the board. We'll use the other side of that tool to shape the actual rails, making it really easy on the bottom side. So here, you really want to be working out of that middle, I'd say 1/2 of the board, making sure to not touch the back quarter to 1/3 of the board. So from here, I'm just marking it about 1/3 of the way up, so it's even on either side, and then we'll do the same to the nose. just as a marking for myself and kind of a guideline of where to start and stop sanding once we start to set that bottom rail. So just doing the same to the front here. And then we'll start to use this tool. So this tool, instead of using that square side, you can flip it around and use the angled side of it. And with that, I'll leave a link to the description for this tool below, and there's a tutorial on how to use it as well. But what I typically do is 20 passes on the bottom, and then about half as many on top, so about 10 passes on the sides of the rails. This is really important to make sure that these are even and that you're counting the number of swipes that you're doing on each side of the rail. And then I'll do about 10, so this is about half as many as I'm doing swipes on the rail. So this is the point where you really want to make sure that you're not actually cutting into that outline and you're leaving a little bit of a gap in between that 1 1/8 mark and that 1/2 inch mark on the bottom. So there should be about 1/2 of an inch gap in between those two markings where you just do not touch whatsoever. So it's really, really important to make sure you're doing so in order to not cut into the outline and warping your actual outline. So I'm just going to do a couple more passes here, trying to connect that, I believe 3/8 of an inch marking and tuck that I marked on this board. And then from there, just going to kind of feather out the nose. And then the tail, you really don't want to touch the tail at all, except for a couple swipes at the very end. So I'm just taking this tool, and then again, really making sure that it's even on both sides. So if I'm doing one swipe at one rail, I'm doing the same swipe on the other rail, really to make sure that they're even. And again, this is something that is kind of shaper's choice, what kind of looks right to you. And then all I'm doing here is just to keep that same kind of ratio of 2 to 1 as I was using before. So here I'm just checking how it feels, checking how it looks, and going from there. Now I'm just feeling out those rails just to make sure that they feel good, and it seems like everything looks good. So I'll start to feather out that nose. So you can just take the same tool, or you can just use a sanding block here to start doing that same process on the nose. Just do a couple less swipes here, since you do want to kind of refine it and feather it in the nose. So yeah, again, just really don't rush through this part of the process. Just make sure everything looks good. Take a step back, put it against the wall, make sure everything looks good to the eye. Again, you can really trust your vision throughout this process. If you stare at it for too long, I think you'll get a little crazy. you'll start to see weird kind of imperfections. But if you take a step back and your initial thoughts is, hey, that looks even or that looks good, you can kind of trust that feeling. So what I'm doing here is just sanding off the rails. So I'm using a fine screen, sand it off, really trying not to touch the last kind of third of the board. Looks like I did a really kind of light swipe there, but you really just want to be blending in those peaks in between those cuts that you did with that mark. So really just blending things in. Really don't want to be touching that back kind of third of the board too much. May have overdone it a little bit here, but the glassers will thankfully kind of true that up for you. But if you kind of overkill on that back third of the board, you won't have a hard set edge, and then the water or the board will just kind of push water instead of kind of knifing into turns and things like that. So I'm here just using a really fine grit sanding paper to just kind of scrub out any imperfections, keep blending in those rails, then putting it back up against the wall, checking my work, make sure everything looks good. Here, doing the last few swipes on the bottom of the board, making sure that those rails look good. So as you're going through this, it's really important to keep checking your work, making sure everything looks good. Pick the board up, feel the rails. Don't want to over screen it because that's where you'll get kind of lopsided rails, but really making sure that everything is kind of all blended together before kind of moving forward to the last couple steps. So for this particular board, making this a swallowtail. So just really easy, really similar to if you are cutting that outline, but I like to save it for the very end of the process. So you're cutting it out here, and then the only thing that isn't fun is just cutting out that middle stringer. Just really being careful here, and then checking to make sure that these are actually even as you're going through this too. If you're doing something like a squash tail or a round tail, you won't have to deal with this. So this is just if you're doing a swallow. So then I'm just sanding down to true up that outline with a small sanding block, and then using this measuring tool to make sure that everything is even. I'm then flipping the board around and then just sanding it down to blend it into the rest of the board. So from here, pretty much done. What you won't see here is I did spend a decent amount more time just sanding everything down with 120 grit sanding block and sanding sponge just to make sure that all the curves and everything looks good to go. So yeah, hopefully this helps. Thanks so much for watching. I'll leave my Instagram in the description below, as well as, again, the tools and the things you'll need, and some other resources that might be helpful. So yeah, finished work, put it up against the wall, and yeah, I'm getting actually the board back tomorrow to get it from the glasser, and really excited to ride it, and I'll let you know how it goes. Thanks so much, and I'll see you all in the next video.